HPA axis, with a special focus on modifications due to chronic stress. I'm Edie O'Connor.
I'm Daniel Bermudez.
And I'm Kelly McCarroll. Homeostasis describes the way our body maintains a constant internal environment despite external changes. Homeostasis is based on the four principles that, 1, an open system, such as our body, requires mechanisms to maintain constancy. 2, steady state conditions require that tendency towards change is met with factors that resist change. 3, the regulating system that determines the homeostatic state consists of many operating systems acting simultaneously or successively. And 4, homeostasis does not occur by chance, but is the result of organized self-government.
The HPA axis works to counteract the effects of chronic stress, thereby maintaining homeostasis by increasing blood glucose levels and upregulating catabolic processes. Increasing catabolic processes provides the body with more energy and decreases events associated with inflammatory responses.
Stress is detected by the central nervous system, specifically in the hypothalamus, which stimulates the rest of the HPA axis. This stress could be physical, such as exercise, or psychological, such as anxiety. The hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, which promotes the pituitary gland synthesis of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. The ACTH travels down the bloodstream to the adrenal cortex, where cortisol is released in response. Cortisol is the main player in the HPA axis because it acts as a negative feedback mechanism to bring our hypothalamus back to homeostasis.
The HPA axis deals with two types of stress, acute and chronic. The first, acute, is usually what we think of. These are the short-term stressors that occur on our day-to-day basis because of demands or pressures that we deal with from the past or in the future. Typically, a person can cope with these small stressors. Small stresses can even be good, like exercise. The problem occurs when the acute stress turns into chronic stress. This quote down at the bottom says, "Thrilling and exciting in small doses, but too much is exhausting." That's the chronic stress. Chronic stress is long-term, and often the person experiencing it can't see the end, and it deteriorates the individual mentally and physically. On the next slides, we will talk specifically about how the HPA axis is impaired due to chronic stress.
If someone with chronic stress doesn't take the necessary steps to relieve their stress, then the negative feedback loop of the HPA axis continues, leading to high amounts of cortisol in the body. At this point, the body normalizes these high cortisol levels, leading to cortisol dysfunction and excess excretion of CRH.
When someone is experiencing cortisol dysfunction, the HPA axis is constantly secreting cortisol, as Daniel mentioned. This causes the binding of cortisol to mineralocorticoid receptors instead of glucocorticoid receptors, which means that the cortisol cannot be processed correctly, and thus the negative feedback loop is not initiated. This ultimately creates an inflammatory response rather than an anti-inflammatory response.
The second problem with chronic stress in the HPA axis, as Daniel mentioned, was excess CRH. Because the negative feedback loop is not working, the hypothalamus doesn't know to downregulate CRH, and a lot of it builds up. This causes three main problems. First, inflammation, which also was a problem with high cortisol. CRH activates inflammatory mast cells, and it also releases norepinephrine, which is pro-inflammation. The second problem is upregulation of a fear-based response. If you think about somebody you know that is always stressed, they tend to stress about things that are hypothetical or irrational or far off in the future that a normal person wouldn't normally stress about. And that's because they have normalized stressing and they constantly need to be stressing about something. And finally, excess CRH can trigger pain when there actually isn't any. The amygdala is the part of our brain that deals with emotions, and it has receptors for pain in it. When there's excess CRH, these can incorrectly trigger these receptors and make someone feel pain.
Now we're going to play a short clip from a video that shows how stress affects your brain.
Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, the brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all, though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, a part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems, depression, and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. Lots of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stimulate cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed, without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms were strong. There's a surprising result. Epigenetic changes caused by one single rat passed down to many generations of rats after.
So as the video showed, and as we'll look into on the next few slides through studies, it's common for individuals who have experienced high levels of stress from a young age to face mental illnesses later in life. This is because the constant production of cortisol eventually impacts gene expression, which can affect the body's ability to respond to stress and change the way an individual concentrates, makes decisions, and interacts with others. Because this impacts gene expression, these changes can be permanent, and they also can be passed down to many generations.
Now the studies that Kelly mentioned. One of our sources, on the next page, there will be a list of all our sources, and it's the one that starts with the author, Farivel. He pulled different studies together in his work and looked at mental disorders like PTSD, OCD, personality disorders, and just general anxiety and depression, and tried to link them to stress that kids face early in life. Before I talk specifically about the 3 studies that we found particularly interesting, I wanted to go over the 2 tests that were used to find information about these studies. The first is the DST test. This uses the drug dexamethasone to see how well a body can suppress cortisol levels. And then taking that step further, DEX-CRH test looks at pituitary and adrenal function by measuring ACTH and cortisol levels after a person has been stimulated by the DST test. So, The first study looked at a group of 90 kids who had lost parents, some of which had mental illnesses, others did not. And it showed that those who did have mental illness diagnoses were experiencing increased levels of plasma cortisol and ACTH. The second study took a group of individuals who were facing separation from their parents. And by separation from parents, this could be anything from losing a parent to just not having them in their life. But the kids that experienced stress showed increased levels of basal salivary cortisol and increased cortisol resisting suppression. And finally, the last test looked at people with personality disorders and comorbid depression. By comorbid depression, that just means they have depression alongside with other disorders. And it looked at the cortisol levels for those people. Now, because of circadian rhythms, we know that cortisol levels change throughout the day. When we wake up, our cortisol levels are going to be higher, and when we start to get tired and want to go to bed, the cortisol levels decrease. But in the individuals with personality disorders and depression, they were facing higher cortisol levels than the normal person would have when they wake up. So as you can see from these three studies, it shows that there is a link between mental illness and stress that kids experience early in their lives. As for the direct results from that stress, nothing can be taken away yet. There still needs to be more research done on it. And these are our last slides with all of our sources. We will link the PowerPoint to Camino so that you can take a deeper look at them.